So when I think of like when you mentioned a couple things that were interesting to me, and I'm sure a lot of people may not even be aware. Like, of course, we're talking about like narrative manga. The term manga has been
Yeah,
very, has
abused.
a yeah, very used. It's been there's a lot of complexities to it that a lot of people
Yeah,
don't really
that's
realize.
right.
Would you mind like kind of expanding on that a little bit for people a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think in the English-speaking world, manga is not only a very used word, but it's a very abused word, frankly, because in of course in Japan, as you know, manga is a generic term. It means just comics, cartoons, and other things as well. It's a much more broad term than is used in North America, for example, where it usually refers to Japanese comics. And usually, I think among fans today, it's long arc comics, long arc story, narrative stories are what people think of from Japan, and often with big eyes and so forth and so on. But of course, in Japan, that's not what they are at all, although they include that. But manga can be single panel cartoons. They can be what are really popular in Japan are four panel cartoons. Those are newspaper comic strips usually, but also in magazines. And they can also be long arc stories. They can be the short stories, long narratives like novels, gags. There's all kinds of things, and they even blur into other areas. So, for example, if you're an old person, say a little bit, I'm old, but even if you're older than I am, you might think that manga could even be like animation. So, for example, in the 1950s, um, people didn't use the word anime in Japan. It was they would often refer to anime as manga ega, which is manga films. And in fact, the very early Japanese animation that came out even before the war, that was usually referred to as manga ega. And in the 60s and 70s, you might have a mother yelling at her children and say, stop watching those stupid manga ega. She wouldn't say those stupid cartoons. She would say, manga ega, and that meant cartoons on the box, like we might say in America. At some point, people might say, hey, you know, you've seen enough of those cartoons. Watch something else, kind of like that. Nowadays, you don't hear the word manga applied to anime so much in Japan, but it does have that past. And there are other sort of formats that are sometimes labeled as manga. One of them is monogatari, which are they're really narrative illustrations, so they don't have word balloons, but they have uh, the illustration, and then they might have like text below. It's sort of like Hal Foster's Prince Valiant in North America took that format, and I guess in the United States we'd call that a comic strip. Um, Now, monogatari are not so popular because it's even Japan has gone very much for this long arc narrative manga, but it's still a generic term. It doesn't mean Japanese comics at all. So when Japanese people are talking among themselves, and they might say, well, in America, they might ask somebody, well, do you have manga? They just mean, do you have comics in America or cartoons in America? They don't mean Japanese manga necessarily. It's a generic term. But that's something that's often, I think, really misunderstood here in the US, because here it's used to, in North America at least, it's used to refer to mainly Japanese comics. And in Japan, it's much more broad than that, much more generic. But I could go on and on forever
Oh
on
no, it's
that
fine.
subject.
Like I just think that the tradition of manga goes back,
Yeah,
so far. Like, it's funny, up until like recently, I used to think that manga like maybe went back to just like Osamu Tezuka and then that was it. But it's like no, like Osamu Tezuka, as important to manga as that he is, and that's not to
yeah,
minimize that by any
yeah,
means. You know, um, the word or the aspect of I guess cartooning, if you will, there's a tradition even before that, even
oh
before
yeah,
his time. And I think that's
yeah,
important to note for the audience out there, because I think
yeah,
a lot of us, especially people who maybe, are, started, reading manga maybe in like the 2000s or whatever, our minds only go back so far because that's all we really know. But like, there was a time even before that. So the tradition is pretty thick, when it comes
Yeah,
to cartooning and, manga or
yeah,
even, and I was going to ask you about Gekika,
yeah,
because
Gekiga, yeah.
like manga eventually, or I'm gonna say, ask like you have the narrative manga like the kind that Osamu Tezuka did, that eventually ended up, and I think you referenced this in one of your books, ended up evolving into like Gekika. How do you feel about like where some of those, how did some of that happen, and then what do you think of like the way that manga is trending today? Do you think manga is continuing to evolve?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the terminology, the word manga goes back a long time, and many people have at least have said that one of the first uses was in a work created by Hokusai, this famous woodblock printer. It's a series of illustrations, a collection of illustrations in multiple volumes. And that was called manga. And but it wasn't comics. It wasn't really cartoons. It was actually, if you look at the actual books, they were pretty serious illustrations. But among the illustrations, some of them were funny, and some of them actually had panels, and some of them had, breakdown of time in terms of using panels, and which are sort of fundamental to comic books today. But over the ages, the word that was used to refer to like cartoons and what we think of today as manga has really changed. So at one point they were called tobae, which are named after this monk, Toba, who created, uh, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, some cartoon-like scrolls. He was a Buddhist monk. And then later on, you heard people say ponchie, which are
Yep.
punch pictures, and the word punch came from the British Punch and Judy, and then there was a magazine in Britain called Punch, which had a lot of cartoons in it. So the word that's used to refer to what we think of today as cartoons has really changed. And one thing I always find in terms of how the word is used in the United States is I always get hooked up a little bit because I notice a lot of people they use the word manga uh, as in plurals or mangas. So if you speak Japanese, that's really a weird concept because it's more like I always try to tell people it's more like sheep. We don't say sheeps. It's it's manga. Manga are plural. They can be give me that manga. It could be a singular manga,
Not
or
mangas.
one manga, or it could be a whole flock of mangas. I'm just joking here, but
Yeah.
it's sort of like sheep. Singular, plural, they're both the same. In terms of like Gekiga, you don't hear the word Gekiga so much anymore. That was really a big, I think, 1960s, 70s phenomenon, and that was coined by a group of people who wanted a more realistic kind of approach to a filmic and serious approach to manga. Um, so, the word is still very much in use, but one of the ironies that is, and in this sense, is very similar to the United States, where people struggle with this word comics. I mean, what's a comic book? Is it funny? Is it comic? No, I mean a lot, a lot of comics are not funny at all, right? They're really serious. You have people dying and weeping, and you might weep when you read it, and we still call it a comic book. So, to me, manga are like sheep, singular, plural, both. But I was trying to mention earlier, one of the things I find kind of amusing is that, in North America, we struggle with the concept or the word comics because what are comics? Are they comic? Are they funny? Not necessarily. So people flounder about and they come up with different terms. And sometimes in North America, we use the term graphic novels to kind of get away from this issue of comic books not being comic all the time when they have like murders and people weeping and that sort of thing. And in Japan it's similar. People struggle with how to describe these things, and probably most people are familiar with the word manga, but in Japan, ironically, one of the words that publishers have turned to is comic. So it's like appropriating the American word comics with all of its problems into Japanese to try and solve this Japanese problem, which is, what are manga really? And the word comic is often used by publishers to refer to um, paperback books, comics. If you go into a store in Japan, you'll often see that, on signs, it will say comics, and that will often refer to paperback books or tankobon. So in Japan, people struggle with this terminology just the way people in North America struggle with it, with the word comics in English.
It's almost like everyone's kind of borrowing, words, but then, there's the negative connotation that can come with those words too.
That's right, and the words are never totally satisfactory. So that's why in Japan you had at one point people were using the word gekiga, and now you have publishers who are using the word, especially for tankobon or paperbacks, they might say comics, and it's very confusing, but kind of fun to watch.